Thou Art the Man by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 3. Cora's Diary for Paternal Perusal. We have been at Callander Castle for more than 2 months, and there has not been an event worth recording, or indeed any circumstance that can be honoured with the name of an event, till this afternoon. The life here since the beginning of August has been as luxuriously monotonous as life on Tennyson's Lotus Island, only we have not enjoyed such a climate as tempted Ulysses and his companions to a perpetual repose. The weather has been distinctly British. His lordship spent the latter half of August and a great part of September in Scotland, shooting. He arrived here at the end of last month, bringing a few friends with him for more shooting. My aunt declined Scotland for this autumn. She wanted nothing but rest after a busy season. Callander is her most established home. Here she has her largest collection of books and music, her favourite Broadwood, her finest garden and hothouses. Here, in short, she has all the things in which a great lady with an empty heart can take delight. Here, too, she is within a drive or even a long walk of the house in which she was born, and the village where she knows every cottage and most of the inhabitants, from the bent old grandfather to the year-old baby. I have done a great deal of cottage visiting with her since we came here, and I must confess that I find cottagers with their everlasting woes and incurable ailments utterly insupportable, and I am puzzled to understand the order of intellect which can take pleasure in personal contact with them. To relieve their wants is a duty and an inclination which I can understand in a person as rich as Lady Penrith, who can never feel any poorer for her beneficence. But surely there are clergymen's wives and sisterhoods and people that one could employ for all this dismal, uninteresting work, instead of bothering about every detail of every old woman's miserable existence, as my aunt does. However, all this twaddle seems to interest her, and I have to sit or stand by while she listens to long rigmaroles about rheumatics, or sick children, or drinking husbands, or sons out of work, or daughters that have gone wrong. It is one treadmill round of human misery, to be mitigated by doles of such miserable amount taken in relation to her ladyship's wealth, that they really might just as well be distributed by a bailiff or homely drudge of a curate's wife. Why Lady Penrith should amuse herself by sympathizing, or pretending to sympathize, for it can't be real, with all those squalid miseries, I can no more understand than I can fathom the minds of those women who get up at 6:30 every morning to attend matins, when they might enjoy the best hour of the day, the hour between waking and getting up, with a cup of strong tea and a volume of Guy de Maupassant stories. I have never allowed my ennui or my sentiments to escape during the frequent martyrdom of this cottage visiting. Far from it. I shake the dirtiest paws, sip the vilest tea, and win all hearts with my jolly good fellow manner, which has given the cottagers the idea that, however sternly conservative the castle may be, Miss Urquhart is at heart a radical. Sometimes I have been tempted into wondering whether all this active benevolence, this sympathy with the sick and sorrowing poor, may not be a self-imposed penance on the part of Lady Penrith, the expiation of her maturer years for some sin of her girlhood. Yet I cannot think that this passionless nature ever deviated from the straight path. Her character must have always been spotless, superior to every temptation. And again, for a woman born rich, there are so few temptations, and Satan must offer so choice a bait when he fishes for the rich man's soul. What other idiosyncrasies besides this regard for the poor that I have observed in my aunt's character? First, her love of music, which amounts to a passion. Secondly, her love of books, which astonishes me, books not at all being in my way. I never read a book when I can get a newspaper, and I infinitely prefer Truth and the World to any of the authors who are called classics. Nor do I see that book learning is of the slightest use to any young woman who does not want to write school books or go out as a governess. The little I have seen of masculine society has shown me that men detest culture in a woman. The men who go in for learning themselves hate a rival in their own field. Scholars don't want sympathy from women. They want blind admiration. And the average man, a monster of ignorance about everything that is not in the newspapers, shrinks from a well-informed woman as from a drawing-room pestilence. To please the sterner sex, a woman should know just enough of politics to be able to listen intelligently to the old fogies and middle-aged bores, and enough about sport and society scandals to be able to carry out a touch-and-go conversation with a young man of average intellect. She may say a smart thing now and then, but she must never pretend to be a wit. She must accept her position as man's inferior and honor and revere her sultan. If my father favors me by reading the last remarks, he will perceive that I have taken his lessons in worldly wisdom to heart, and that I am studying how to please a potential husband. There is one here, Mr. Coverdale, Lord Workington's only son, who would be worth pleasing, but alas, alas, penniless and plain, must shoot at lesser game. To return to Lady Penrith. She is a reading woman, and her morning room is lined with books, all of her own collection, and entirely distinct from the orthodox library of standard authors on the ground floor. I amused myself a few days ago, while I was waiting to go out driving with her, by a careful study of these books. I have been told to study the lady's character, and some part of her character must reveal itself in the books she chooses. I found poetry strongly represented by poets old and new. Byron, Shelley, Keats, Browning, and Tennyson are lavishly spread along the shelves in various editions, with a richness of binding and variety of style that mark the lady's appreciation. Milton and Shakespeare are equally honored. The poets fill a large section of the bookcases near the fireplace, and on this side of the room my aunt has her favorite armchair, tea table, and Japanese screen. If anything could make me fond of reading, it would be such a room as this. The novelists are here also: Scott, Dickens, Thackeray, Lytton, George Eliot, and here and there a volume by a lesser light. Then come biography, history, criticism, and metaphysics. My aunt seems to have taken all learning for her province, as somebody says of himself. One block of books especially interested me, for they suggested a warm interest in a subject which I should consider very remote from Lady Penrith's line of thought. On the shelves below the poets, and within reach of her hand, as she sits in her low bergère, I found a collection of books on African travel and African sport, from Livingstone downwards. I never saw so many books on one subject in any library I ever looked at. I asked myself, with natural wonder, how and why a woman who is utterly indifferent to sport in England and Scotland should be so keenly interested in sport in Africa, and why a woman who has traveled very little in Europe should be interested in books of travel in that uncivilized quarter of the globe. The only answer to the riddle which offers itself to my mind is that the lady's interest in Africa is vicarious, and that the man to whom she gave her heart in youth was in some manner associated with the dark continent. I have found her poring over Burton or Cameron, Stanley or Baker in the lazy hour between afternoon tea and the dressing bell. I once ventured to ask her how she could find amusement in books which to me appeared essentially dull and dry. And she looked up with her sweet smile and answered, "There is not a single page in these books without interest for me, Cora." "And you would like to travel in Africa?" "Dearly." "Why don't you, then?" She gave a faint sigh before she answered, Hardly any woman could run the risks and endure the hardships to which these men expose themselves, and if any woman could, the world would not let her do it. My duties are at home." "Or I would hold every duty subordinate to my own whim," said I. "If I wanted to roam about African deserts and ride across African swamps and see the falls of the Zambezi or the mountains of the moon, nothing should prevent me. I would defy opinion, as Lady Hester Stanhope did." I like to tease her about her wealth and its omnipotence sometimes. I think it is the sting of conscious poverty which goads me to remind her what a power she possesses, and how poor a use she makes of it. How deeply sad her face was while she spoke of Africa. Yes, that is the charm. Her lover must have been a wanderer in those wild pathways. That next time I find myself alone in her morning room, I made a further examination of her African collection. I looked for any volumes by less familiar names, thinking that among these I might find some book written by the man she loved. Very few men travel much in strange lands without delivering themselves of a book. Sooner or later, the thirst for paper and print takes possession of them. They hunt up their old journals and random records of sport and eke out their own scanty materials with plagiarism from Burton or Stanley. I found one volume, a thinnish octavo, which attracted me for two reasons. First, it was more delicately bound than any of the other books. Secondly, it showed signs of having been more read. The title was unpretentious, My African Apprenticeship. The name of the author was Braddon Mountford. The year of publication, 1874, just 12 years ago. On the fly leaf I found a brief inscription, From B.M. to S.H., May 6th, 1876. B.M., of course, stands for the author, S.H. for Sybil Higginson. It was not until the following year that Sir Joseph Higginson's daughter became Lady Penrith. Dear little book, to give me such precise information about yourself. B.M. to S.H. Only a lover would write thus. Anyone upon ceremonious terms would have written from the author. I looked into the pages. The usual thing, descriptions of scenery, descriptions of storms, sunsets, sunrises, aurora borealis, wonderful effects of sky, perils of being eaten by savages or wild beasts, perils of having nothing to eat, lion shooting, fever, friendly natives, nothing of personal history to tell me what manner of man Braddon Mountford was. But that vellum-bound book, with its delicately tooled edges and gold lettering, and with leaves that open so easily, with here and there a rose petal or withered violet, told me one fact for certain. Whatever B.M. may have been, saint or sinner, Sybil Higginson loved him, and Sybil Penrith cherishes his memory. Oh, irony of fate, that one woman should own over 1 million and sit in her lonely room brooding over a dead man's book, while thousands of women in the world are striving and wrestling to get themselves decently married for the sake of food and raiment, a shelter, and a fireside. Had I a 10th part of Lady Penrith's money, what a variety of pleasures, excitements, and enjoyments I would wring out of this brief existence of ours. I peeped into the billiard room after lunch today and saw Mr. Coverdale knocking about the balls by himself in a low-spirited way, so I lingered in the room for a few minutes, looking for last week's punch, and presently he invited me to play a 50 with him. He is a poor player, and I am a poor player, though I have done my possible to make up for the deficiencies of my education by playing whenever anybody condescends to ask me, and by practicing whenever I can get the table to myself. The 50 took a longish time, for besides our slow scoring, the Honourable and Reverend John was in an expansive humour and talked a good deal about his views, which are ritualistic to a degree that verges on Romanism. I humoured him to the utmost. Indeed, in religious matters I am ritualistic if I am anything, and we had a really interesting conversation in which I seemed to get more in sympathy with this cold pattern of propriety than I ever have been before. Indeed, as we put our cues into the rack, he made me a little reproachful speech, which was, to my mind, a compliment. "You are like St. Paul, at least in one attribute, Miss Urquhart," he said. "You can be all things to all men. No one who heard you talking slang with the shooters yesterday would anticipate your delightful conversation today. Now observe, O author of my being, that your daughter's delightful conversation had chiefly consisted in holding her tongue. I had let him talk, and only said just so much as was necessary to lead him on to descant at large upon the theme he loves. Intelligent listening means sympathy, comprehension, everything to a talking man. The clock struck 3. My aunt generally drives out at 3 o'clock, and as a rule I go with her. It is one of my duties or privileges, whichever I like to call it. I rushed up to my room and put on a jacket and hat, snatched a pair of gloves, and flew downstairs to the hall and out to the great flight of steps which approached this stately castle. The barouche was at the door, and my aunt was already seated in it. At the sight of my flying figure on the steps, the footman descended from his perch and opened the carriage door. In another minute I was seated at her ladyship's side. "I did not know you were coming with me, Cora," she said, and I detected a shade of annoyance in her tone. Offended at my unpunctuality, no doubt, thought I, but it struck me afterwards that upon this particular afternoon she wanted to be alone. I apologized for my late appearance, and she affected an interest in my account of Mr. Coverdale's conversation, but I could see that her mind was otherwhere, and she spoke at random. We drove to Cargill, a village on the seaward side of the great dreary moor which separates Callander Castle from the civilized world northward of its walls. Her ladyship stopped the carriage at the first house at the village. "I am going to some of the cottages, Cora," she said, "but I shan't stay in any of them. Would you like to sit in the carriage till I have done? There is the 19th century to amuse you." She pointed to a half-cut magazine on the empty seat. I hate those learned periodicals which presuppose a corresponding erudition on the part of the reader, and the notion that Lady Penrith did not want my company gave a stimulus to my curiosity. I jumped out of the carriage with alacrity. "I had much rather see your cottagers than read the 19th century," said I. We went into several cottages, with the usual results. Ailments, rheumatic and internal, sore legs, swollen faces, all the disagreeables of life, sons out of work, husbands given to drink, the old, old story. My aunt was sympathetic, took note of all necessities, and promised relief. In all this I could see nothing out of the beaten track, but I observed that in every cottage she asked the same questions about a man she had seen upon the moor on the previous afternoon, a man who looked like a shepherd, very ragged and poor, and, as she thought, not altogether right in his mind. No one was able to identify the person she described, though many suggestions, more or less wide of the mark, were offered. She exhibited wonderful pertinacity in this inquiry. We went from hovel to hovel till I was heartily sick of the subject. What did I care for a ragged man who was or was not of weak intellect? "I should like to help this poor creature," said my aunt, and she charged every one of whom she inquired to make it his or her business to find this ragged personage in order that he might be clothed and put in the way of being restored to his right mind. "Is there any asylum for lunatics in the neighborhood from which the man could have escaped?" she asked of an elderly woman who had given more signs of intelligence than the other aboriginals she had questioned. "None nearer than Durrock, and that's a good 40 miles from here." The search was evidently hopeless, and my aunt's benevolent intentions were to bear no fruit. The afternoon was cold and windy, with that parching east wind which is harmful alike to complexion and temper. I felt my nose was blue, and I knew I was in a very acrimonious state of mind. The change from stuffy cottages to the bleak outer air was too trying to have been patiently endured by a saint. Yet Lady Penrith seemed alike unconscious of the nipping cold outside and of the frowsy warmth within. Not contented with this wearisome house-to-house inquiry, she drove a long round on her way home in order to repeat her questions at every half a dozen isolated cottages, and it was nearly dark before the towering bulk of the Penrith stronghold appeared across the grey distance. I never look at that medieval castle without a faint pang of envy which no amount of recently acquired wealth, much as I adore money, could inspire. That legacy of past ages stirs the small modicum of romance in my nature. I envy Lady Penrith in the possession of that fine old fortress, and I am proud to think that I am one of the race whose forebears held it in the days when every great nobleman was a warrior chieftain, and proud to think that I am descended from ancestors who fought for king and country when England was young and bold and warlike, rather than from some plodding lawyer who won his peerage in the dust and din of the law courts and by subserviency to the powers that be. So you see, Father, you who are of the world worldly, there is a thin thread of romance still running through the warp and weft of your daughter's character. All your lessons in the craft that rules mankind have not extinguished my reverence for the past, and my belief in the value of ancient lineage, a value in one's own secret estimate of oneself, the feeling that, come what may, one is better than the ruck of mankind, better inherently by superiority which dates from the Crusades, and which no achievement of newly made wealth can cancel. I contrived to suppress all demonstrations of vexation during that long, cold drive with its circuitous extensions, but I could not restrain my curiosity. You must have some special reason for being interested in this ragged man, I should think, Aunt, by your earnestness in searching for him, I said, when we had turned our backs upon a wretched stone hovel half hidden in a dip of the moor. You are right, Cora. I have a reason, she answered quietly and in a tone that forbade further questioning. I hugged myself in my sealskin jacket and muff, her gifts, and I told myself I must wait for the time and chance to show me the nature of her reason. It must be a very strong one, if I have any power to read her face. All the resources of my intelligence are henceforth pledged to the solution of this social mystery. I have very little to think about now that the all-absorbing question of ways and means has been made easy for me, and for want of interest in my own insignificant existence, I am naturally thrown upon speculations about my aunt. If John Coverdale would only condescend to fall in love with me, life would take different colors, would change from dull, uniform gray to the brilliant variety of the rainbow. Not that I am in love with that handsome pattern of propriety, mark you, but every girl wants a lover. The conquest of man is woman's mission, the only mission worth a woman's thought, and not to be admired and loved is to be outside the pale. I am plain, let me not forget that. Plain, but not repulsive. I have good eyes and teeth, and you have told me that my face lights up when I talk, and that my complexion improves by candlelight, and that I have a quality which you call chien, and which is not without its charm for the opposite sex, especially the duller members of that sex, who are apt to be caught by smartness and gumption in a woman. This much of praise have you given me, O my Father, in the course of our conversations across the morning coffee and rasher. Am I smart? Have I gumption, I wonder? I recall the stories I have heard of plain women and their conquests, and it appears to me that the unbeautiful have been very often winners in the race. One hears of men who forsake lovely wives to go to perdition for plain and even elderly mistresses. One hears of men who line their bachelor rooms with pictures of beautiful women, who go about declaring that only perfect loveliness can charm them, and who unite themselves in lifelong union with sallow complexions and snub noses. I will remember all these anomalies when I am inclined to despair of my own fortunes. And in the meantime, I will devote my leisure to the study of my aunt's character. She has been very good to me, and I ought to love her dearly. There are times when I tell myself that I do so love her, and then perhaps a cold wave of doubt comes over me. She is so handsome, so calm and self-possessed. She has been so favored by fortune and nature in all those respects where I have been hardly used. Is it human in me to love her? More especially when I much doubt if she has any affection for me. She is a woman whose life is ruled by fixed principles and ideas. I believe she endures me and protects me just as she goes to church on bleak, uncomfortable mornings, because the thing is a duty and has to be done. End of chapter 3.